Okay, welcome to this April edition of the Texas Book Festival's monthly book club. My name is Sergio Troncoso, and I'm president of the Texas Institute of Letters and editor of this new anthology, Nepantla Familias, an anthology of Mexican-American literature on families in between worlds, which was published by the Wittliff Literary Series in San Marcos, and also by Texas A&M University Press. So the anthology recently received a starred review from Kirkus Reviews, which praised it as, quote, a deeply meaningful collection that navigates important nuances of identity. Today I'll be talking with three writers in that anthology, Jose Antonio Rodriguez, Diana Lopez, and Francisco Cantu. But first, a few items. We're not live this evening, so we won't be able to answer any new audience questions, but we'd like to encourage you to leave comments in the chat box. We would love to hear what you think. We would also like to encourage you to click that Buy That Book button below. By purchasing the author's books through our partner bookseller, Book People in Austin, you are supporting the authors themselves, independent bookselling, and the Texas Book Festival. So before we get to the authors, let me just say a few words as the editor about the anthology, the scope and intent of this Nepantla Familias. So the first, when I was approached to edit this collection by the Wittliff Literary Series, I really wanted to focus these writers on this concept of Nepantla, which really is the Nahuatl word from the Aztecs that means living in between cultures, between languages, Spanish and English, between psychologies, identities, even geographies. And this is quintessential of the Mexican-American experience. And it's of course, in my mind, has always began with Gloria Anzaldúa, who is a great influence, a philosophical really influence on me. And she explored this issue of Nepantla, and I continued to explore it certainly in my work. And I wanted writers to focus on this issue, and I wanted them to focus on this issue through their families, because of course, I always believe that the decisions you make about where you belong, how you belong, whether you belong, or whether you never belong, often happen within families. All of these negotiations and failures and successes. And the other thing I really wanted from these writers, and all the writers I chose, I was very picky. I'm not going to tell you who I rejected, but there were some big writers I rejected because I just felt their work didn't speak to Nepantla. And I also wanted new work. I did not necessarily want work that was already out there published. So of the 26 writers that were published, they produced 30 works, and all but 5 of them have never been published before. And of those 5 that were published before, all but 1 of them have appeared only in literary journals and recently in the last year or 2 or 3. So they're not even widely available. So this is basically new work from great Mexican-American writers that I admire. And you got 3 of them right here today, and that I learned from. And so I created the kind of anthology that I think is also very forward-looking to what this issue of Nepantla and identity and really becoming American. And the last thing I'm going to say before I turn to the writers is at the heart of this anthology is really this emphasis on empathy, emphasis on how when you learn to navigate crossing borders, living on the border, how it really encourages you not just to understand the Mexican-American experience that really in many ways defines Nepantla, but also allows you to understand other peoples, other cultures. And so there's a certain universality to it that I think anyone who reads it will understand if you always try to create yourself from many disparate cells and geographies and psychologies, and sometimes struggled and sometimes failed and sometimes succeeded in bringing these influences into yourself and creating something brand new. So this, I think, anthology will speak to you. And so I hope that you will pick it up. So let's start with our first writer, Jose Antonio Rodriguez. His most recent books are the poetry collection, This American Autopsy, and the memoir, House Built on Ashes, a finalist for the PEN American Los Angeles Award. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, Poetry, The Nation, and Patterson Literary Review. He holds a PhD in English from Binghamton University and teaches creative writing at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. Welcome, Jose Antonio.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. Sergio, and thank you for including me. Thank you for this space. Thank you to the other writers for sharing this space with me. It's really lovely to be here, especially in the middle of the pandemic, right? We're getting together and creating communities difficult. I particularly cherish these moments. So what I'm going to read from is the poem that you included in this beautiful anthology, which I'll show the cover right now because it's so pretty. And it's called The Last Time I Went to Church. It is autobiographical. It has to do with my father, who was 100% Mexican, born in Mexico. I was born in Mexico too, but I came to the US when I was 5. So I'm very much a mixture, but my father was 100% Mexican. He never learned English, which means that I kept the Spanish, and I thank him for that. So the last time I went to church, my father's body was in a casket. Up there near the altar, near the light, I've been told. The last time I went to church, my oldest sister asked me why I didn't weep. Not when I got the phone call, not when I entered his room. My mother and my aunt silent as candles. Not when I lifted his body from the bed to lay on a stretcher, bound for the funeral home, and clumsily banged his head against the narrow door frame. Not when I thought then of the last hospital night, the timbre of his weeping. Each sob smaller than the last. Each, it seemed, both lament and deliverance after countless sleepless nights. No more, he said, no more. Not when I sat at his bedside then and held him, turning his shoulders until he said, "You're hurting me." A reminder of the ripples of our lives' days, hardly ever interrupted by touch. The last time I went to church, I told my father, who I'm told surely must have been sitting next to me and free of pain, "I'm so sorry about the door frame." Thank you.
Thank you, Jose Antonio. That was a wonderful reading. I love that poem, and have just reread it actually to my wife just recently, because I just thought it was so beautiful. And it spoke to my relationship in many ways to my father, which I think is, something that connected us, right, on the page. So thank you. So let's go to our next reader, and then we'll get into a discussion in a few minutes. Diana Lopez is the author of several middle grade books, including Confetti Girl and Lucky Luna. Her debut picture book biography of Selena Quintanilla will be released in the summer. She recently retired as an educator, but is still teaching by serving as a mentor for Latinx in publishing and AWP's Writer-to-Writer program. Welcome, Diana.
Thank you for having me. I'm so thrilled. And I too am really enjoying the anthology. I know that our readers are going to find so much to appreciate and love in it. I'm going to read an excerpt from my story. It's called Dutiful Daughter. And it was inspired in part by my first years of work life. I started my work life working in hospitals as a lab tech. And one of the things I had to do was draw blood. And so I just kind of went back into that time. So here it is, Dutiful Daughter. Juanita stepped into the outpatient clinic at Spawn. She wore scrubs, but she wasn't a doctor or nurse. She didn't carry a stethoscope. She carried a tray with needles and tubes, and that was okay because orderlies didn't carry anything. Maybe she wasn't a doctor or nurse, but she wasn't an orderly either. She was a phlebotomist. She liked saying it, phlebotomist. At first, Juanita thought it was spelled with an F, but when she learned it was spelled with a P, she straightened up a little. Lots of medical jobs were spelled with P. Podiatrist, practitioner, pediatrician. Other jobs started with P, but not the P sound. Psychologist, physician, physical therapist. Originally, she wanted to be a forensic scientist, which did start with the letter F, just like it sounded, but she didn't think she could graduate from college, then graduate again, then do rotations, then take a national exam. She went to Del Mar Community College instead, and she didn't have to graduate or do rotations or take a test for the certificate. Hi, Juanita. This from the client care specialist, the CCS. She didn't need any college for her job. I got your order for the lab. The patients in the lobby glanced up, saw Juanita's tray and flinched. She could tell they understood her job now, even if they didn't know her official title, phlebotomist. Lots of people didn't know that word, but they knew other words. That's why when she first stepped into the clinic, Juanita pretended. She wore scrubs, so it was easy. In those few seconds before the CCS or someone else called her out, the patients, she hoped, had spotted her and thought, there's the doctor. But since she was young, if they thought, there's the nurse, that was okay too. Juanita grabbed the order, then stepped through swing doors to a hallway lined with examination rooms. A chair was there and a scale. Even now, a patient stood on it while a nurse, a male nurse, fiddled with the weights. I'm looking for Mr. Jefferson, Juanita said. The man getting weighed said, you here to take my blood? Yes, sir, if you don't mind. Of course I mind. He smiled as he said this, teasing. The nurse wrote down the weight, then asked Mr. Jefferson to sit, then put the blood pressure cuff on his arm. I'll be done in a bit, he told Juanita. That's okay, she answered, but she was bothered. Why'd she have to wait? The cuff got tight on Mr. Jefferson's arm, then started to hiss as it deflated. Juanita wondered how it worked, what the top and bottom numbers of the blood pressure meant. It wasn't part of the program at Del Mar. Maybe that's why she had to wait, because she didn't know stuff like this. The nurse wrote more numbers on Mr. Jefferson's chart and took a step back. Juanita peeked at his badge. LVN. No big deal, though obviously he thought it was. She couldn't worry about it. She had work to do. She grabbed a purple top and a red top. Then she twisted a needle into the vacutainer tube. You're a regular vampire, aren't you? Mr. Jefferson said. I'm not a vampire, more like a mosquito. She lifted the armrest, then propped Mr. Jefferson's arm on it, tied the tourniquet over his bicep, and tore open an alcohol swab. His eyes got wide, but he didn't say anything. You're going to feel a little prick, she said, getting the needle ready, then winking, just like a tiny mosquito bite. She wasn't lying. She had the touch, no pain at all for most patients. There wasn't much to understand about her job, but she knew this. Blood was warm, and veins, healthy ones, bounced back. Veins from patients on prednisone were hard to pin because of the excess tissue fluid, which made them float around. Veins from drug addicts felt like cords from all the scars. And a good stick meant the blood softly gushed out, while a bad stick meant it came out in squirts. Juanita rarely had a bad stick. Juanita could get blood from a rock.
Thank you, Diana. That was great. Terrific. Wow. And you know what I was thinking about? The reason I love that story was this. When Juanita, the main character, is trying to do something that her family does not understand, beyond her, what her father or mother really understand, that either she's going to do it by herself or she's going to do it with criticism from them. And so there's this loneliness to going beyond. And that's for me was certainly a lot of my life And so I identified a lot with Juanita's struggle to push ahead. So thank you. That's a great story. Love that story.
Thank you for including it.
Love that story. So now let's go to our final reader, and then we'll get into a little discussion. Francisco Cantu is the author of The Line Becomes a River. Great book. I hope everybody buys that book. Excellent. A former Fulbright Fellow and the recipient of an Art for Justice Fellowship, his writing on the borderlands appears in The New Yorker, Best American Essays, and BQR. A lifelong resident of the Southwest, he now lives in Tucson. Welcome, Francisco.
Thanks so much. And thanks for the beautiful introduction and organizing this panel and this collection. It feels like a real honor to be included. And I also just, to echo what everyone else has said, I feel like you've curated this wonderful conversation in the book, and also, created a community among us on this panel and among us who are in the collection. And like you said, it's a book to learn from, and I'm happy to be part of it. I'm third generation, so it was my grandfather who came over from Mexico, and my mother did not grow up with the Mexican side of her family, so a lot of her life has really been a process of sort of rediscovering her Mexican half. And so that's sort of the theme of the essay that I'll read from, that's included in the collection, and I can just barely read it all in the time limit here. So I'm gonna go ahead and read the whole thing. This is called Calle Martín de Zavala. My mother and I arrived in Monterrey, Nuevo León, with a handful of photographs and place names connecting us to a long-buried family history. Records of ancestors and landscapes almost as obscure to us as ghosts. On the morning of my 34th birthday, we walked through a quiet neighborhood just outside the Barrio Antiguo along Calle Martín de Zavala, a street that, after carrying multiple names through the centuries, now bore that of an early colonial governor. As we walked past homes with newfangled exteriors and cinder block additions, it was hard to imagine that we were, in fact, walking along the same street where our forebears had lived before their eventual flight to the border, the same street where my mother's grandparents celebrated their wedding at the turn of the last century, and where her father was born on the eve of the Mexican Revolution. My mother has few memories of her father. Growing up, she possessed a single photograph of him as a young man dressed as a Mexican charro, squinting under a broad sombrero with a pencil-thin mustache and a cigarette hanging loosely in his fingers. When she finally arrived in San Diego to knock on his door at age 17, she could barely believe that the portly man who stood before her was actually him, the man who helped breathe her into existence. Their meeting did not portend a new understanding of one another. For her father, it would always remain easier to not speak of the past, to not leave oneself vulnerable to what had long ago been left behind, unchangeable and impossible to explain. For my mother, who lived most of her life devoid of any stories of her Mexican family, a trip to Monterrey was a chance for reclamation. My mother and I hoped to find, somewhere on Calle Martín de Zavala, the facade of a building that might still resemble the pocket-sized photograph we had of the family home taken in 1912, a crooked image of a two-story Spanish-style row house with wrought iron window bars and balcony railings. Under the early October sun, we made our way past countless homes, searching for matching features, but few of them maintained any of their historic traits. After nearly half an hour of walking, we stopped at an impromptu taco stand erected on the doorstep of a neighborhood home. "Pasen a comer adentro," a woman called to us from inside, "para que no les pegue el sol." We took a seat at the woman's dining room table as she began heating tortillas on her kitchen stove, listing the various guisos we could choose for our tacos. As she prepared our order, we told the woman that we were walking this street looking for the house where my mother's father was born. We handed her the black and white photograph. She squinted and then quickly passed it back to us, waving her hand dismissively. "All the viejitos who remember what things looked like back then are long dead," she told us. My mother and I ordered a round of tacos, and the woman began to tell us how she had inherited her home. She wasn't from Monterrey, but she had come to this street to care for her tia when she became immobilized by old age. She had grown up high in the Sierra, she told us, in a town called Rayones. She told us how her father used to work in the pecan orchards, and how her mother sold bread and sweets made from the nuts, pan semita, nogada de nuez, bolitas de leche quemada. As she became older, her family slowly began to come down from the mountains to work in the citrus fields of Montemorelos. Eventually, many of them moved on to Monterrey, abandoning forever the mountain passes, the pines, the clean air, the towering spires of limestone. Never in all my years did I think I'd end up on a street like this in the middle of the city, she told us. Pero uno nunca sabe dónde va a caer. It wasn't until several days later that I would realize how this woman had shared with us, over 2 plates of tacos, more about her life and the place she came from than my grandfather had ever shared with us about his own. In the coming days, my mother and I went on to visit the outlying towns where her father's parents were born, stepping foot in the same churches where they were baptized and where generations before them had kneeled to pray. These moments, however, were always underlined by a sense of remoteness, by a growing awareness of how little we actually had to situate or guide us. My mother, having inherited so little from her father, was being made to search for him through a haze. After all, when ancestors fail to share their stories with us, we go looking for them nonetheless. My mother and I finished walking the entire length of Calle Martín de Zavala without ever finding exactly where her father was born. Instead, we passed by, without knowing, the home that had first offered him shelter, by the place where he spoke his first words and took his first steps, the place where he learned, slowly, to make sense of the world. Thank you.
Wow, that was terrific. You're a great reader, Francisco. And I have to tell you, you bring out exactly what I loved about this essay. This pacing that you had is almost like an incantation that when I first read it, I found it mesmerizing. And anyway, just that's what caught me. Apart from what you were talking about in the essay. And in my mind, I think your essay fit with one of the things I was trying to do, which is to be forward-looking, thinking about my nieces and nephews, thinking about my sons, already 2 or 3 generations removed from Mexico, that are still looking to the connection, you know, even though they're removed and they live in Chicago or they live in New York, you know, and that's what I felt. You know, we need to be speaking to this younger generation, you know, and I think your essay is one of a few that actually does that. So anyway, I hope all of you can unmute yourselves. I'm going to ask you some questions now, and then, you know, just take turns trying to answer these questions because they're really meant for all of you. When I sometimes hear about Nepantla, this liminal existence in between cultures and languages and countries and identities, I sometimes sense that some see this existence as either a weakness or an indecisiveness or even a confusion. But I have often seen Nepantla, or at least how I experienced it within my family, as a strength, even a painful gauntlet that forced me to pick and choose who I became. But how does Nepantla, as it occurred in your family, a painful trial that in a way was productive to who you became and what you care about?
What an excellent question, Sergio. You can tell that we're all like, let me think about that for a moment. But I do think that, I mean, it's impossible to escape, you know, to escape that your family, even if you leave your family, when you leave your family, they're always with you. And, you know, and for me, it was, you know, like you mentioned earlier, the loneliness was a great description of what it was like for me growing up. And it was confusing because I was so alone, but how could I be alone when I was surrounded by people who loved me, you know? and it would hurt me to feel lonely in the midst of wonderful people who loved me, but who I felt didn't quite understand me. And so my parents just didn't know what to do with me, but I know they tried their best, you know. And it was just things like, you know, when I was in the 3rd grade, I asked for a dictionary for Christmas. And I thought that was such an odd present, but I loved words, and they gave me a dictionary, you know, and just like little things like that. But along the way, I've met people, you know, that have offered me many times just one sentence, and the sentence to save my life. And at the moment I heard that sentence, it was the right moment. And I remember, you know, one person that I could talk about this loneliness with was my high school senior English teacher. We maintained our friendship after I graduated from high school. And she told me, she said, there are people like you, not many, but there are people like you, and you will find them. And I held on to that, you know, I trusted her with that insight, and she was right. She was right. As I went through life, I found people like me. And so kind of helped me cope with, you know, for me, very much like my dutiful daughter story, I did not want to in the future be asking what if. I didn't want to give in to my fear of forging my own path, you know. So kudos to those angels that have visited me at the right moments.
I think if I may piggyback a little on what you said, for me, I think, and for my family, if I'm honest, I think that in between space was first experienced as confusion. And it certainly was confusing to me, myself being an immigrant. But I think the root of the confusion was that I thought that I had to pick a side, right? That I could only be one or the other, and that my parents were one, that is Mexican, and that I should be American because I was over here. And that's sort of like certainly the message I got from school and the media and stuff. And so that space that initially was confusion because I felt like I had to make that kind of drastic decision became a space of potential, a generative space for creativity. Once I realized I didn't have to choose a side, I could be the middle, and that was all right. In fact, it might be even better than all right, you know, to have a window into more than one culture and more than one language and more than one set of values. And so it definitely, that space of the middle has definitely sort of its function has evolved. And I'm very, very happy where I am with it now.
I really love that question, Sergio, and I love all those answers. And I feel like for me, that in betweenness, and I think like for my mother, talking about it with my mother too, you know, what occurs to me is that it presents this, it's like an ongoing process. I see that for my mother, that it's like, you know, it's kind of like a constant negotiation with a dominant culture and with one's past, which I think, you know, is often obscured from us by all sorts of forces, you know, inside and outside of family dynamics. But you know, what I think is so special about this term Nepantla, you know, is that with this term, you know, Anzaldúa kind of gave us a name for this, but you know, a name that's also tied sort of to a physical space, you know, that and it's a word other than border, right? And I think that's important because, you know, as everybody's alluding to, right, like you take it with you even when you're far from the physical terrain. The place of the border, you know, extends into the psycho-spiritual realm, And I think linking those two things, it just, you know, it helps give us the language and the tools for like understanding what this is. And I think, you know, the border as a terrain is always, I think, in the discourse as we see every day, you know, just it's always sort of othered as a place, you know, and it's sort of a place that's at the edge, and it's like a neither here nor there. And you know, this idea of Nepantla, you know, gives it a name and anchors it in a place and makes it not an in-between. It is an in-between space. It's defined by in-betweenness, but it's also its own place.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems important. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just to kind of throw in my 2 bits, which is not much until we get to this next question. You know, I mean, for me, it was when I started out, certainly in Isleta, you know, I felt like an outsider, but only until I left. When I left, but even within my family, I had similar experience with Diana, which is my parents didn't know what the hell to do with me. I did not fit, although I was, you know, as Mexicano or Mexican American as my brothers. But then when I went north, you know, to Boston and Connecticut, the more I started fitting in, the more that made me nervous. The more like, no, I'm actually gonna, you know, the more I could fit in and shed this outsider status, the more I said, no, I'm adopting it. And so it turned at a certain point in which I thought it was much more fruitful not to get taken in by whatever culture it was, whether I was in Isleta or whether I was in the Northeast, because then for me, it meant you're stopping and not asking questions anymore. You're not forcing yourself to adopt what you want to be, rather than just assuming your place, whether it's through privilege or through, you know, bad assumptions. And so for me, that was sort of my, you know, my trajectory. Let me ask you another question, because I love hearing your answers. You guys are so smart. When we think about identity, too often we think about static entities, as if being American was somehow a fixed concept. Yet I see the experience of Nepantla at the heart of what renews and remakes our country. Tell me in what ways you think your experience of Nepantla is redefining, reinvigorating what it means to be part of this country. Why must we always push back against these static definitions of identity?
For me, living on the border, growing up on the border all my life, and being a marginalized in different ways, a marginalized quote unquote American. I think the reason identity is generally or has been historically accepted as something static is a reflection of the norms established by the nation state, right? To create a kind of cohesion. But living in the borderlands, we are very literally geographically and economically and ideologically very much at the margins of the nation state, where the ideology and the assumptions begin to kind of unravel and begin to be challenged by the proximity to the quote unquote other, you know? And so even identity then becomes unmoored, unfixed. And it reveals, I think, a deeper truth of identity, and that it is that in fact what the nation state has tried so hard to instill in its citizens, this idea, for example, of fixed identity is in fact a social construct. And so there's a beautiful kind of other side to the idea of marginalization, which is the ability to question the norm. And certainly fluidity, I think, you know, is truer to who we are. And that's sort of integral, I think, to the borderlands, both literal and as a concept. Yeah.
You know, you mentioned, Sergio, earlier about thinking about, you know, the next generation, the next people to come. And And I love this question about identity. And, you know, we do have this kind of static fixed concept. It makes me think of my own nephews and nieces because, you know, we have a very multicultural family. And, you know, my brother's wife is Black. And so I have a nephew and niece that are Afro-Latino, and my sister's husband's Filipino. So I have two nieces that, you know, kind of encompass both those worlds. And, you know, it's an interesting conversation to have with them, you know, because I feel like I see a lot of articles or even there was a photo essay a few years ago. I think it was from the National Geographic where they had pictures of biracial children. And the question was, you know, what side do you identify with, you know? And it seemed like everybody had an answer. And I often wonder that about my nephew and my nieces. I remember visiting once and calling my niece Mija, and she was like, "What does that mean?" You know, and it just comes out for me, you know. So I don't know why we have this need to like put ourselves in one camp or another. Why it's so hard for us to, you know, embrace the beauty that is, you know, multiculturalism within ourselves, but, you know, within our country, there's always just been this push for one vision. But it is important that we push back, and we have to push back every single day with every word that we write and speak, because if we don't, then we're losing something. And I would hate for us to, you know, lose what is so beautiful about, you know, well, what's beautiful and unique about all of us. But that's an excellent question. I wish I had more to say about it, because I probably could go on forever, but I think that you've given me an opportunity to like open this door with my nephews and nieces and just like, let's talk about this. Let's talk about identity, and let's talk about, you know, how fortunate we are, you know, when we have Thanksgiving together and next to the turkey is fish eye soup.
I think like I'm so glad I keep going last because Sergio, these questions are so packed. You know, I feel like really lucky that I get to listen to the other two answer first before myself. But yeah, I think, you know, echoing what Jose Antonio and Diana have already said, that idea of, you know, having, you know, like there's this border, and for such a long time, it's you know, when you get to one side or the other, you know, you're supposed to choose one of these identities, right? And so I think so much of this has to do with the forces of white supremacy. I've been thinking a lot about this because, of course, you know, my mom grew up with the white side of her family. But then I've been thinking also about sort of the experience of my grandfather's generation too. And, you know, they grew up in Monterrey, and that's, you know, it was one of the wealthier cities. And, you know, when I don't know exactly when this started, but right, like when they came to the United States, they very quickly did not want to identify themselves as Mexican, and you know that exists in Mexico too for a long time, right? The idea of being European or Spanish, you know, that's what white supremacism looks like, you know, south of the border, one of the many manifestations of it. And for them, I think, you know, coming to the United States, it was almost as if they very quickly, at least like publicly, I feel, you know, ran away from that identity of Mexicanness, or Latinidad or whatever. And so I think, you know, like part of what I hope that, you know, like this conversation and what I think, you know, your book is doing, and all these authors who are in this book are doing, right, is, you know, you're introducing, bringing these things out into the open, these questions, and, you know, sort of like throwing aside, chipping away at these harmful mythologies and cultural constructs and all of that. And, you know, like if I had access to some of this language, I think like earlier in my youth, or if my mother had access to this, you know, like when she was growing up, I think it would have made a big difference how she identified, and at what and when, you know, she started to identify.
Yeah, I mean, I hope the book is itself a bridge, which is, I think, you know, one of the things that you're saying, Francisco. For me, it was always, I had this joke I say, and I've given a lot of talks. I said I would be the perfect mayor of Jerusalem. My parents are Christian Catholic, my wife is Jewish, and my sister's Muslim. And all of that's true, and it has been true for decades. And so, you know, you can imagine when we get together for Christmas at the dinner table and everyone flies into El Paso, and you know, we're all next to each other and we're all familia. And so for me, this idea of choose a side, I think Jose Antonio sort of has a really great broad geopolitical reason for that, and I think that's absolutely true. But it's also, and I've experienced going to Mexico, or you're just a you know, you're just a you're not a real Mexicano. You're, you know, when I lived in El DF for a year, you know, I only became somewhat real after spending a year there, and I learned Chilango Spanish a little better than the border Spanish. But you know, the issue is always trying to make peace with who you are wherever you are. And so let me just go to the final question, so that I don't keep chatting myself, because I really want to hear what you guys have to say. And this is really for the future again. And what advice would you give young writers, or the younger generation in general, experiencing their own version of Nepantla as either immigrants or the sons or daughters of immigrants, or even the next generation beyond that? How do you think their experience will be different from what your experience was?
Gosh, I guess like I'll go first to break it up. You know, I feel like a first thing is to like ask questions of your ancestors who are alive. You know, I think probably all of us experience this. You know, when an ancestor passes, you know, we wish that we knew more of their stories. And it's hard because, you know, you have to, I think, be a certain age maybe to ask. But, you know, I think you can always, you know, you can usually find you know, for me, it's like my second cousin who feels more like a tia, but she, you know, she holds a lot of the family stories now, because she grew up with that side of the family. And so I'm able to, and you know, she's getting old, and I feel like there's still so many things that I want to ask her and hear from her, and you know, sometimes it feels like this race, you know, to collect as much as you can, and I remember expressing this to another writer, I think it was Cristina Rivera Garza, and you know, just kind of talking about, you know, like that puzzle of trying to piece together these you know, parts of identity or family history or legacy or story that feel lost. And, you know, she told me that, you know, that so much of it, there's a very writerly answer that I love, but that she kind of like burst the bubble for me, that a lot of it, you know, it really does come down to imagination. And, you know, I think oftentimes we don't imagine something of our ancestor unless we've like it can anchor it in an actual specific story. And I think like for writers, you know, allowing ourselves, you know, I write in nonfiction, so I think, you know, those constructs are always, they feel a little more rigid, but, you know, kind of giving ourselves permission to imagine, you know, the experiences and stories of our ancestors, I think can help us bring us closer to our own.
I advise to the younger generation how I think there's certainly value in finding a space and feeling a sense of belonging. I know certainly that I have been, it's sort of, you know, it has been a desire of mine, of course, ever since I can remember, feelings as I did, so displaced in so many different ways, you know, being queer and being really broke, and being an immigrant and stuff. And so there is that push to belong and to find a space and to find common right people, like-minded people. But I come back to I also come back to something that I find very valuable, which is what Edward Said, the late great cultural theorist, called the exilic mind, and he advocated for artists and intellectuals to cultivate an exilic mind, which is something like what you were saying, Sergio, earlier about going to Connecticut and feeling like, oh, I'm finding my place, and then realizing, wait, might that be tricky? Is that a little too slippery? Does that make me less inquisitive? Does that make me a little too compliant, a little too comfortable? And which is exactly what Said said. Said said, be careful with being a little too comfortable. You stop asking questions, and that can be a little bit dangerous, to stop asking questions. And so I guess that's what I would say to the younger generation. Hopefully things are better off for that younger generation than they were for me right now that I'm in my 40s. But never stop asking questions. Never stop asking questions.
You know, that's so true. I love what both of you said in response to this question. And, you know, I write for young people, and a big part of my motivation for doing this is, you know, when I used to teach middle school, and this would be in the 90s, there really weren't, you know, very many Mexican American authors available to them, and the stories that you know we had access to had like one version of the Mexican American experience, and a lot of times it was the migrant farm worker, you know, or the gangbanger, you know, or the person who just crossed over. And the school I taught in, you know, it had a very high Mexican American population, but that wasn't their experience. And so really got into writing for them as a way to fill what I thought was a void in that type of literature, so that, you know, I always tell people, it's been years since I taught that group, but every time I write a book, I always think of it as a gift for those younger readers, because I'm sure, you know, many of us have had the experience of not having access to stories that reflected, you know, our world as we were, you know, growing up. And I don't ever want a child of any background to have to go their whole childhood without reading a book about their neighborhood or you know, or their people. And I'm very passionate about this. I mean, I see it, you know, I love to write because it's fun, but I also see it as a mission of mine to fill that space for our young readers, you know. So I would tell them, you know, that their stories are valuable. And, you know, one of the things I encounter a lot is a lot of people or a lot of young people even, that they want to write, but they feel like, you know, they're not interesting enough. Their lives are not interesting enough. And yes, their lives are interesting. And all of us are mysterious in some way. We don't recognize it because we're living it. And maybe we know our own world, but we are mysterious to somebody else. And you know, and we have to tell our stories, and we have to tell them in our voices, whatever that voice may be, you know, and whatever informs it, because we're adding to the whole tapestry of, you know, the human experience, and, you know, and the American experience.
Well, thank you all. Those are great answers. And, you know, we're nearing the end of our program. And I just wanted to say, you know, this anthology, Nepantla Familias, I hope is that kind of filling in the gap for the future. And many other people, you know, will come out with new anthologies much later. But this one at the moment, you know, fills that void that we need filled, that needs, you know, to be answered by this next generation looking at these questions. And also, you know, to avoid this sense of when you're being asked to be certain about choosing a side, that in itself is a trap, whether it's a certainty in your own mind or a certainty in nationalities, or to not ask tough questions about somebody's asking you to do this or do that or choose that value or discard this value, you know, I always believe in that the deep freedom a writer has to ask even the most taboo questions of their own culture and of the culture that they're in, you know, even if it's not their own. So, so for me, that's always how I operate. And so I wanted to just thank, you know, Jose Antonio Rodriguez and Diana Lopez and Francisco Cantu, you know, 3 terrific writers. You heard them yourself. You know, I could stay here and listen to them for hours. And I want to thank them for joining us for the Texas Book Festival. And thank you also to the audience members for listening. And remember to click that Buy the Book button to purchase Nepantla Familias. When you purchase our anthology or any book from the Texas Book Festival, you're supporting the writers, you're supporting independent book selling and the Texas Book Festival. And we certainly appreciate it. Finally, I want to thank Matthew Patton, the literary director of the Texas Book Festival, for organizing all of this panel and for the hard work of the staff and to bring literature and authors to audiences in Texas. Thank you again for attending, and pick up a great book to read today.